Hello, honeys, and welcome to our first ever sequel. I'm very excited to provide this episode to you. Very excited that life decided to surprise me and give me the opportunity to discover enough information to make this happen. Now, you may have heard me explain in one of my recent Instagram reels that I was inspired to do this episode after my second trip to the Chazen Museum and seeing its modern glass exhibition on display. I was really excited to get a sort of more recent taste for glass than I had been given at the Nelson Atkins. So after going home from that and doing some research to see if this episode really was possible, if there was enough information about modern glass available to me, I found in fact there is, and so here we are. A few of our notable sources for today include the High Museum, the Met Museum, and the Corning Museum of Glass. Of course, there's plenty more available to you in the source document here in the episode description. And so, honeys, here we go. Reflections of Modernity, our very first sequel. Now, aside from the inspiration being, of course, that modern glass show that I saw, I chose the 20th century for a couple of reasons. This is when glass really starts to be produced in most nations and for domestic consumers, with a rise in the production of artistic pieces alongside functional vases and bowls. And of course, it's interesting to cover this 100 years-ish worth of style changes. We see, for example, everything going modern by the 1950s, and that lasts until the postmodernism of the 1970s and 80s, which gave way to contemporary, aka the 1990s to 2000 movement. What's cool is that all three of those saw/supported the rise of the studio glass movement, which we'll circle back to, but for now, know that that means the latter half of the 20th century saw glasswork's evolution from a male-dominated field centered on glass blowing to a worldwide vehicle for contemporary expression. We'll take a moment to set the stage here, give you a bit of lead up to the last half of the 20th century. A little bit of important action happens in the first half of the century. For example, in 1947, glassmaker Maurice Heaton perfected the technology to shape and fire imagery on the underside of his glassware. He used a combination of flat glass, crushed enamel crystals, and his own iron molds and furnace to do so, and that was very noteworthy at the time, and along with inspiring other American glass artists, he went on to teach them as well. Some major figures begin branching off into other forms/norms of glasswork, however, at the same time that the medium overall gets attention from major shows that occur in the 1950s. Now, a quick walkthrough of some of those aforementioned major names. Among the foremost was Cleveland-based sculptor Idris Eckhart, who began her career as a well-respected ceramicist, but shifted to glass in 1953 after researching a lot of ancient techniques and becoming fascinated with the medium. She went on to have a very influential career that we will discuss as we go along chronologically today. We also had Francis and Michael Higgins, who were a very important glass artist couple who met at the Chicago Institute of Design and who founded the Higgins Studio in 1948. From 1950 onwards, they fabricated functional as well as decorative wares out of their Chicago home/studio. The pair are recognized for their use of available kiln forming techniques like fusing or slumping, aka heating glass over a mold to harden into a certain concave shape. The Art Institute of Chicago writes of them, quote, "By the 1950s, Higgins glass was recognized and sold nationally, and in 1957, the couple entered into a partnership with Dearborn Glass Company," end quote. They go on to write, quote, "Francis and Michael Higgins effectively rediscovered the ancient art of glass fusing, the merging of two glass sheets through intense heat, which had been almost abandoned in favor of glass blowing," end quote. Wink, wink, hint, hint, that becomes relevant later in our story. The 1950s are also the height of the fame of Sir Alastair Pilkington, geez, I'm struggling with that one today, who was born in 1920 and died in 1995. He invented the float process, which is now the world standard for high-quality flat glass manufacturing. He began experimenting with various processes in December of 1952 and managed to make an imperfect yet flat piece of glass very early on. He decided to keep going to achieve perfection each time, knowing that creating a beyond industry standard glass 24/7 would create a huge advantage over any other competition at the time. Ultimately, Pilkington took until 1959 to get it just right. Believing so very much in his idea, idea, he even jumped the gun a bit in 1955 by making the formal decision to build multiple float process machines. 7 years of effort and approximately 28 million pounds at the time, or 150 million pounds in today's money. For my Americans, that's over 198.9 million of our dollars. In research and development expenses later, in July of 1958, a high-quality sheet of glass made entirely by the float process was produced, and he announced this cutting-edge process to the world the next year. But here's where his legacy gets a little hairy. Pilkington decides to begin licensing out the rights to use the process, and that decision has been widely disputed because many consider it controversial for him to have given away a prime spot in the market and not take advantage of a monopoly gold mine. Yes, how entirely horrifically shocking that he would choose not to create a monopoly. All the same, especially with that licensing of the rights, float glass explodes in popularity and becomes the world standard for high-quality glass manufacture. These days, around 500 glass float lines operate in the world. But the Corning Museum of Glass suggests that the biggest step forward that decade comes with a single show's impact at the very end of it. The exhibition relied on 5 object selectors. These included an Italian architect, an architecture historian and curator, a furniture designer, a museum director, and a magazine editor to each choose 100 glass objects from more than 1,800, which had been shipped to New York for evaluation, while they were all gathered together for a single day in a Manhattan warehouse. Funny enough, although mutual agreement about said objects was not required, not even expected, it clearly happened a lot as the exhibition was finalized with only 292 objects. Nelson Rockefeller, the then governor of New York, was recorded as describing it and other exhibitions of its time as, quote, blurring the line between art appreciation and consumer education, opening museums to new visitors and introducing fine glass objects to new buyers, end quote, in his remarks at the exhibition's opening. Today's sources say that reviewers recognize that the unusual process of Glass 59, that use of a curatorial board, shaped the diverse exhibition of glass objects and its representation of the current state of / work in the medium of glass at that time. Our sources write that the critics too had trouble singling out individual pieces among the plentitude. They also write that it was a commercial feeling show, though atypically immersive for its day. The gallery was full of largely elegant glass objects that were displayed exactly as they would be used in homes and offices, most likely done to give exhibition viewers a compelling sense of the need to keep up with the Joneses, especially because most objects in the exhibition were mass-produced and available for purchase. However, our sources point to the surreality of that abundance, the sheer amount of objects, slightly breaking the illusion that this was a home or office space. Furthermore, the exhibition catalog's attached price list, according to our sources, seemed to reinforce the expectation that the objects first seen in the museum would ultimately become a part of everyday living spaces across the U.S. And last but not least, I held out on one figure because he is such a huge one in our story, didn't want to rush him. We see the appearance in the 1950s on the arts scene at large of Harvey K. Littleton. Born in 1922 in Corning, New York, Littleton grew up near the Corning Glass Works, where his father served as vice president and director of research. The High Museum notes that he himself eventually chose an art career, of course, first gaining recognition as a ceramicist and later as a glass blower and glass sculptor. Littleton began his long-term relationship with the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1951 as the head of ceramics there, but 6 years later, he took a leave of absence to travel to Europe, and after visits to several glass-making establishments there, the interest of making his own glass was sparked. Littleton became convinced of the potential of, quote, glass as a medium for the arts, end quote, and was inspired by the groundbreaking work of artists, for example, ceramicist Peter Voulkos, who lived 1924 to 2002, often associated with the studio crafts movement. That one emerged in the years right after World War II in the U.S. and is often recognizable by bold, non-traditional / experimental forms and its emphasis on the artist's involvement in the making process. Littleton thus began experimenting with hot glass in his studio in 1958 after joining forces with research scientist Dominic Labino, who invented a small, inexpensive furnace furnace which could be used to both melt and work hot glass. That invention is very significant to our story because it made it relatively easy as well as affordable for artists to blow unique sculptures in their own studios. Moving along our timeline, the 1960s. This is an important decade for the kickoff of American and especially studio glass. As the Corning Museum of Glass writes, quote, "Until then, almost without exception, glass objects had been blown or molded in an industrial context. That is, they were factory made," end quote. But this is the decade we see that paradigm change. Although they may once have had a label lost to time, most 20th century glasses, particularly factory-produced glass, has no signatures or any identifying marks of the maker or designer. Unlike the examples we're about to discuss, these can only be dated and or attributed by careful examination of style, form, design details, tones of colors, and making techniques. And here's where we circle back to Littleton. In 1961 and 62, he holds a series of informal workshops at the Toledo Museum of Art that would turn out to be groundbreaking, ones to explore the art of hot glass making in a studio setting. He does this with the aim of moving the manufacture of glass from its industrial setting at the time to diverse and independent American glass makers, especially ones in fine art, because at this point, after visiting a few other European glass makers who, as we mentioned, could work alone, Littleton has become convinced that a single artist can maintain a complete glass-making facility within a studio. Littleton, along with Dominic Labino, who is by now a fellow artist, begins work on the creation of a low-melting glass formula at this point, while participants in these classes build a small furnace that they use to melt down marbles and then blow glass, thereby proving the viability of artist-run glass studios. The results of these workshops are immediate and impactful. In 1962, Littleton establishes America's first university-level hot glass program at UW-Madison. He goes on to spread the study of glass art throughout the United States and around the world, along with several of his students, including Dale Chihuly, Fritz Driesbach, Martin Lipovsky, and Michael Taylor. The invention of the low-melting glass, the workshops themselves, and the previously created furnace by Labino together birthed the American studio glass movement. That movement kicks in with the 1970s, and we're going to delay that to talk about one other thing in the 60s first. The 1960s are also impactful and fascinating because this is the decade that our international history of glass connects back to American development. According to our sources, some American artists were able to take glass blowing into experimental and or innovative directions in the early 1960s, but most faced similar obstacles. Maybe the biggest one was a lack of technical knowledge in the craft of glass blowing, which was nearly extinct in America. Such artists looked instead to Europe, where glass had thrived for centuries, to start collecting the knowledge and skills once more. As our sources put it, and our prequel proved, Scandinavian and Czech glassmaking has certainly been influential, but the Venetians have played the most significant role in the development of glass across most of history, and definitely continued this role in the development of contemporary glass art. Quote, "The Italian impact on contemporary glass throughout the world, and especially the United States, is the most recent chapter in the complex history of Venetian-style glass. Glass is a technically demanding medium, and Italian glass working techniques are important tools with which contemporary artists realize their creative ideas," end quote. The 1960s see the first American studio glass artist to travel to Venice, Dale Chihuly, born 1941. This is another who surprisingly began his career with something else, weaving, but in 1963, during a weaving class at the University of Washington, he first incorporated glass shards into woven tapestries and quickly dove into the medium at large. In 1968, Chihuly wrote letters to dozens of glass houses on Murano requesting permission to observe their glass blowers. He only got one reply, a yes from Ludovico Diaz de Santillana, the director of the Venini Glassworks on the island. Chihuly would be followed at Venini by American artists like Richard Marquis, Benjamin Moore, and Marvin Lipovsky, etc., and this began a sort of informal exchange that would shape the next chapter of the history of glass. Muranese glass masters begin arriving in the U.S. to teach as well, opening new opportunities opportunities to many young American artists. As you might imagine, this shapes ultimately some of the major features of contemporary American glasswork. Some recognizable characteristics of the Venetian style often reimagined in contemporary American glass art include the use of soda lime glass, a preference for classically proportioned and blown forms, flawless techniques that may or may not involve complex internal or even applied decoration, bright colors that feel elegant and cheerful. And now, honeys, the early 1970s. This time frame sees overall shifts in opinion about what is art, as well as the purposes of craft and design. These all start to blur the hierarchical lines that have existed till that point between traditional art, decorative art, design, craft, architecture, and that blurring allows for greater artistic freedom in many mediums. Says the Met, quote, during the 1970s in both Europe and the United States, the liberal political and social climate encouraged a new freedom in artistic expression. Artists who wanted to work in the medium of glass could take courses in colleges and universities and even graduate with a degree in glass making, end quote. The look, meaning, and demographics of glass making as well as buying change with the so-called studio glass movement erupting in 1970 through 75-ish, especially because increasing numbers of artists no longer had to rely on any part of the glass industry to create unique masterpieces. This independence is in part where we get the movement's name from. Studio glass becomes the term given to unique pieces of glass handmade by individuals who are also the designer or artist to distinguish those from glass designs serially produced in a factory. The medium of glass might be used by a studio glass artist, for example, in the same way that paint, bronze, or clay would be, to convey a strong artistic element or message. This decade also sees Littleton's teachings from the early 1960s continue to spread. Dale Chihuly, whose masterworks in glass and remarkable enthusiasm was already helping establish glass across the art world in a more recognizable, respected format, founds the Pilchuck School near Seattle in 1971 and devotes it solely to the making of glass art as well as to the teaching of various techniques available to artists. Then, in 1972, Littleton makes a controversial proclamation that changes just about everything. At that year's National Sculpture Conference, he argues, quote, technique is cheap, end quote, and focuses attention on the split between American glass artists who think that their focus should be the refinement of their technique and those who believe it should be the expression of the conceptual. Now, because most American glass artists want their work to be seen as quote-unquote fine art, they increasingly follow Littleton's lead across the next several years and shift away from experiments in abstract sculpture towards narrative works and assemblages, often featuring more personal message. Ultimately, this conceptual expression wins out over the refinement of technique. We can look to the works of a number of artists to see this shift in opinion. We have Erwin Eisch, who lived 1927 to 2022. He worked in Bavaria, engraving and painting his glass portrait heads of Picasso and Buddha with images expressing the horrors of war. You also have William Gudenrath, born in 1950, who has made his career into a series of investigations into the processes and techniques behind the luxury rares of the Venetian Renaissance's golden age of glassblowing, at times drawing inspiration from works in the Corning Museum's collection and combining or editing parts of them to appeal to contemporary audiences. You also have Jenny Ruffner, who lived 1952 to 2025. She explored the women's liberation movement and the history of art through her lamp-worked sculptures. Our sources also point to Thomas Patty performing quote-unquote brilliant experiments with fused plate glass, Mary Schaefer, more on her later, who made voluptuous slumped glass and metalwork, and William Morris, whose forms reportedly evoked elements of the past to prove that this is what they see as a limitless period. This is a decade we see increasing numbers of people get involved in the studio glass movement. Says the Imagine Museum, located outside of Tampa, quote, studio glass movement extended beyond American shores, as evidenced by the groundbreaking work of Czech glass artists Stanislav Lebensky and Jaroslava Brychtova. Known for their innovative cast glass sculptures, their work demonstrated a fusion of artistic expression and technical mastery. Their partnership resulted in pieces that embody emotion, depth, and a sense of mystery, redefining the the possibilities of glass as an artistic medium, end quote. This is also the decade that women's presence really begins to be seen in the movement. The Jason reports that in its infancy, studio glass blowing was largely a man's occupation, but the early years of studio glass paralleled the beginnings of the women's movement overall, or the second wave of feminism, more accurately. For example, Mary Schaefer, graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, who in the early 1970s decided to take the opportunity to utilize equipment in Chihuly's glass program, she recently recalled that she avoided glass blowing there because of its male domination, instead beginning her ongoing exploration of slumping in other spaces. Our sources note that the demographic of contemporary glass continues to change to this day because of her and women like her. The early 1970s also sees the invention of fluoride glass occurring at the University of Rennes in the mineral chemistry labs via a quote-unquote fortunate mistake. Says Jacques Lucas, who today is a professor emeritus and a member of the Academy of Sciences, we wanted to synthesize a complex fluoride with a new crystal structure. Michel Poulain, research engineer, and his brother Marcel, academic researcher, obtained a material whose structure was the opposite of that of a crystal. This was an entirely new type of glass, a totally unexpected result from this fluoride family, end quote. 3 years after the discovery and the publication of an article about it in a scientific journal, Marcel Poulain and a partner opened a company called Le Vert Fleur, quote, created in situ from the laboratory team because industrialists showed little interest in our discovery, end quote, in the words of Jacques Lucas. Fluoride glass is used in things like spectroscopy, fiber lasers, chemical sensing, and medical imaging, among other things. And now, honeys, moving to the late 70s through the 80s. Beginning with a few individual updates from that decade, upon retiring from UW-Madison in 1977, Harvey Littleton moves to Spruce Pine, North Carolina to focus on glass blowing and vitriography, or the art of printing on paper using glass plates. Idris Eckhart goes on to make 5 editions of 10 sculptures that revisit the Alice in Wonderland themes of her earlier ceramics, but at this point using one of her discoveries, the lost wax casting process, to make them from glass. Why does her use of that process matter? Because earliest known examples of the technique date to 6,500 years ago. This is how the Mesopotamians, Greeks, and other ancients made duplicates of their sculptures, but often using bronze and with more steps. It is a very fussy process, so I'm going to give you the simplest version of how it works. An artist first makes an original model out of wax and then forms a rigid outer mold, often a ceramic shell piece, around it, leaving an open bottom space to release the wax from. Then, hot or powdered glass is poured into this ceramic shell, and you add some heat, the wax pours out, leaving space for that glass to fill your mold and solidify. You let it cool over the course of a few days, and bam, you have a new sculpture. Very cool technique for her to have figured out, and really kind of admirable that she's going back in time for techniques at the same time that everybody else is kind of moving forward with the conceptual. Back to the late 70s at large. By this point, glass has gone mainstream. There are 3 commercial glass galleries founded in the 70s and early 80s that paved the way for commercial fine art connections in the field at this time and even for a little bit after. These include Habitat Gallery in metropolitan Detroit, Heller Gallery in New York, and Holston Galleries in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. We additionally see a few major glass publications from this time, including Ray and Lee Grover's Contemporary Art Glass of 1976. The technical advances continue in glassmaking of the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s as well, including moving even further beyond the focus on technique and expanding even more interdisciplinary efforts. In order to achieve dramatic scales associated with contemporary sculpture, for example, that would be impossible with blown forms, we begin to see the augmentation of glass with a variety of media. We see it mixed more frequently. The Chazen writes, quote, in 1981, highly respected Seattle-based critic Matthew Congas acknowledged this trend in a review about Thurman Stanton's hand-fabricated plate glass sculptures that are filled or covered with shards, cast and blown elements, found objects, graphite, and paint. Writing, quote, Statham offers strong proof that the future of glass as art lies in its combination with other media, end all quotes. They also turned to unusual unusual formats and inspirations during these years. According to the Corning Museum, artists from the American Studio Glass movement additionally found inspiration in the perfume bottle form because its typical small format made it into a good template to master traditional shapes and skills, to experiment on with new techniques or with new shapes, and to innovate with color. These experiments sometimes transformed the utilitarian bottle into a small sculpture instead, making fragrance a secondary concern for the owner to address later. A very important example of an artist who had this focus is Silvia Vigoletti, an important member of the movement who explored the expressive properties of glass often in small-scale sculptural works. She was known for forming the inner cavities of her vessels by fuming, a process of blowing hot steam into the glass bubble and coloring it using vaporized metals. Another example of innovative and important work at this time includes that of Michael Glancy, who graduated RISD in 1980. He became interested in electroforming and electroplating, which are traditional metalworking processes, and developed his lifelong aesthetic by the time he graduated from the school. His compositions are made by first carving and acid etching sheets of plate glass or blown glass blanks, then the glass surfaces themselves are electroformed or coated with copper and sometimes topped with silver, which might oxidize, forming a rich patina over time. An example work also featured in our visual episode is Star X from 1980. It has a very eggshell paint-looking finish and a very dark tone, like a very deep yet almost satiny gray. If I didn't know better, I would think this was metal and not glass. I also find it interesting that the so-called stars emerge as points of protrusions, which come out of the center of various dips. It looks like little arms that are cut off. The slight ombre from white to orange, top to bottom in these star ends is also visually interesting and gives the whole piece a sense of flow. The late 70s and 80s see the spread of and continued development in studio glass techniques across the globe. This leads to, from the 1980s onwards, most nations having, quote, a handful of prominent glass artists, end quote, even considering the rapid rise in decorative glass production in the Far East during the same period. All the same, we see in the very late 80s/early 90s the rising availability of so-called hired guns, individuals technically proficient in glassmaking and able to execute others' ideas, which allowed artists of any background to employ glass in their art. And this, honeys, leads us up to the landscape of glass as a fine art medium today. Quote, today's glass art differs from studio glass in that it is content-driven, end quote. So clearly the pendulum swung back once more, away from refinement of technique and again to conceptual personal meaning. Writes the Corning Museum of Glass, quote, contemporary glass is fascinating for its sometimes unexpected approach to material and expression of ideas, for the versatility and skill of the artists, and for the beauty and often large size of the objects, end quote. So let's talk about some of the stuff I saw in our inspiring exhibition. The most standout because it affected me the most personally was a piece by Michael Aschenbrenner, a Vietnam veteran who has used his ongoing damaged bone series since the mid-1980s to tackle his post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which resulted from witnessing combat. These were probably the most personally effective to me, honeys, because they made my old injuries ache a little bit looking at them. They're so very true to life. They look like real bones, even multiple bones joined by a joint, though some are in slightly atypical colors like black, brown, blue. All the same, they're rather starkly hung there against the wall, and you just see the various splints that look homemade. They look like just twigs and anybody's gauze that they may have had in a 30-year-old medic kit. Some of the curved formations go a step further. They have wires connecting the ends of certain bones, making them look a little bit more like hunting bows. Having broken both the bones in my right wrist twice, you can imagine that this one reminded me of what that pain was was really like in the middle of it, what it was like to have a splinter cast and have that supported yet limited sensation of movement. Both of those wrist breaks were a little traumatic. Both of them involved car accidents of one kind or another. So to see that sort of recognition, that representation of force, of abstract physical violence represented in this piece was really almost disturbing in a way that I didn't expect, but it felt important at the same time. Another standout was Loaded Messages by Australian artist Scott Chaseling, who began converting vessels into three-dimensional canvases back in 1998 using comic strip-like imagery to portray daily life. This particular piece juxtaposes two scenes, quote, addressing global issues with two that relate to self, end quote. One of the outer images shows a person with a blue face, apparently just blowing smoke or air against a yellow background. The other shows just the side, the eye of a man's face, I'm assuming man based on the short hair, and his hands front and center pointing a gun. One of the inner images shows a man in a blue shirt under some sort of desk lamp, perhaps being interrogated, while the other side shows a woman with tree branches for arms raised up above her head, leaves in the shape of hearts spurting from said tree branch arms. Her eyes are closed and her face looks peaceful even though her nude breasts are exposed. The piece is really puzzling. We're unclear on exactly what each of these people or these situations is meant to represent, but I had never seen 4 vignettes of 4 different people captured in one glass vase like this, so I had fun walking around it, continuously trying to figure out what exactly the narratives were. And finally, we had one sculpture from the Boyhood series by Clifford Rainey. Rainey uses his 10-year-old godson very frequently as a model for those sculptures in that series, along with other works, to reflect on the political and religious unrest in the Northern Ireland of his childhood, quote, in hopes that art will beget a better world, end quote. Titled War Boy from 2005, this particular example was trisected at about the heart and then the hips. It is headless and limbless with a giant incision cutting all the way down through the throat, the torso, and then splitting at the hips over to the left leg. It has rather grisly looking sutures made up of perhaps a metal rope or a twine that hold the rocks, filling the sculpture's hollow center inside. This was another piece that had not only a very physical, visceral sense to it, but also really spoke to physical bodily trauma, to the ugliness, the violence that can befall a human body. That it looks like a youthful body with no real muscle definition makes it all the more of a tough sculpture to look at. But don't get too down, honeys. Not all of it was sad or themed with trauma. There was, for example, a work by the Swedish Bertil Wallén called Man 009129 from 2000. That one was made to look like a person's head and sandblasted to the point of having a more ceramic exterior texture. It featured a protrusion out of the forehead that acted as a window into the center of the sculpture's mind, so to speak, and had some sort of reflection or other slightly dynamic with your movement internal piece that was fascinating to look at. And so, honeys, that is glass as it stands today, its transformations during the 20th century, and how it became such a popular, beloved part of fine arts as a medium. We hope you learned something from our sequel. We hope you found it as necessary as we did, and prepare for more businesses and more content coming your way as soon as possible. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to write in or leave a comment on your various streaming platforms if they allow you to do that. Otherwise, until next time, honeys, hydrate or dihydrate, take care. We'll talk very soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.